Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? In 1997, Apple did something no one was really expecting. It produced the world's fastest laptop. This time, let's explore how the company that had become the joke of the computer industry managed to pull it off. This is the PowerBook 3400, and in order to understand where it came from, we first need to go through a bit of Apple laptop history. If you're impatient, you probably want to skip ahead. It all starts with a Mac called the PowerBook 5300. It had the internal Apple codename M2 and was developed between the end of 1993 and the middle of '94. It was destined to be the successor to the PowerBook 500 series, which had not only received awards for its industrial design, but had also gotten solid reviews and proved to be well loved by the people who bought them. That series had been designed by Daniel Delouis at Apple, who was responsible for some other striking products like the Mac Color Classic. So when the task of coming up with the 5300's looks went to fellow Apple designer Masamichi Utagawa, well, there were high expectations. The machine was supposed to be an even greater marvel of design, which would be underscored by the fact that it would be Apple's first native PowerPC-based laptop. What Utagawa came up with certainly wasn't ugly, but also didn't set the world on fire. Though fire does play into its history a bit. Utagawa had gone for a more minimalist look, moving away from the curvy, two-toned appearance of the 500 series towards something simpler and more utilitarian. There were some clever ideas hidden in the design, like the spring-loaded pop-out feet to elevate the back for more comfortable typing. But in terms of features, the machine was, well, pretty boring. Initial plans suggested it would be able to support a CD-ROM drive, which the 500 series lacked, but the desire to keep the machine compact killed that idea. The movie Independence Day featured a scene where the 5300 had a special drive for reading smaller 3-inch CD-ROMs, but this never made it to production. The computer had several other scenes in that movie too, all part of Apple's heavy push into product placement, including a pivotal role where it's responsible for transmitting the computer virus that ultimately defeats the aliens. Given the public perception of Macs at the time, many actually found this rather comical. Anyway, even though the optical drive was out, one useful new feature remained: the idea of swappable drive modules. The machine shipped with a floppy drive, but it could be easily pulled out and something else like a zip drive, hard disk, or special power adapter installed in its place. And as promised, the 5300 was indeed smaller and lighter than the 500 series, despite offering a larger screen on models with a color display, 10.4 inches versus the 500 series 9.5. But there were some steps backwards too. The 5300 only had a mono speaker compared to the 500 series stereo setup. It also had only one battery bay. Something that 500 series owners loved was the dual hot swappable batteries that offered excellent runtime. And also related to the battery came the machine's first bit of controversy. The 5300 was supposed to ship with lithium-ion batteries, which were relatively new for laptops at the time. But an engineering problem right as manufacturing was beginning saw two machines start on fire while charging. Now, neither of them belonged to customers, and the resulting recall was minuscule, like 100 computers. But it was still a big story and seen as a sign of Apple's diminishing quality. The company was quick to blame Sony, who it had contracted to build the batteries, but in order to get the machines to market for their September 1995 launch, it had to fall back to nickel metal hydride chemistry, which didn't last as long on a charge. The longest lasting complaint about the 5300 though was that it just wasn't all that fast. Even though it could be had with either 100 or 117 MHz PowerPC, it didn't perform as well as it should have because Apple skipped including any Level 2 cache. And because the processor was soldered to the motherboard instead of on a daughter card like in the 500 series, there was no way to upgrade it. So ultimately, the 5300, along with its Motorola 68040-based twin, the PowerBook 190, well, they didn't have a very good reputation. At the time, a number of people were thinking that Apple was moving in the wrong direction, and this laptop didn't help. Yet, as unloved as it was, the 5300 played a big role in the design of two subsequent PowerBooks, both of which ended up being much more successful. The first was the PowerBook 1400. In order to more quickly move past the mess that was the 5300, Phil Baker, who was Apple's director of entry-level laptops at the time, well, he bypassed the internal design and manufacturing teams and instead went to a Taiwanese company called Quanta. They're what's known as an ODM, or original design manufacturer, and Baker's team picked out a basic laptop chassis Quanta had already come up with. This meant Apple's designers only needed to tweak its looks to better fit the existing product line, and Apple's engineers didn't have much work to do either, as Quanta was essentially given the schematics to the 5300's motherboard and just told to make it work. The 1400 offered the one key feature people wanted, but the 5300 lacked: a drive bay large enough for a CD-ROM module. It was also a sturdier feeling, albeit heavier laptop, and the cost savings of going through an ODM like Quanta let Apple price it a bit more competitively. It was targeted at home users and students, and a novel feature that Apple's designers added with them in mind were removable panels for the back of the display. They were called book covers, and a clear one let you stick photos or drawings underneath, or swap it out entirely for a panel with a different finish, like wood grain or leather. When the machine debuted in October 1996, it got far better reviews than its predecessor. Now, none of them were exactly glowing. It wasn't an amazing machine by any means. Because the 1400 was based on the 5300's architecture, even the 1400's developer notes call this out explicitly, well, it had the same limitations. The base CPU option was 117 MHz, just like the higher-end 5300, but that meant it also lacked a Level 2 cache. It also had the same RAM limit of 64 MB, which for some users was becoming a bit of a bottleneck. Reviewers also found its design boring, and the machine overall just wasn't very exciting. But it was still a much better computer than the one it replaced, and there was this collective sigh of relief that Apple hadn't screwed it up again. It was the first time Apple had outsourced production of one of its major products, and it had worked out great, proving that at least some of Apple's well-known internal dysfunction could be bypassed. And as a side note, Phil Baker had actually done something like this previously at Apple, just at a smaller scale. He got Inventec, another Taiwanese manufacturer, to build the second generation of Newton PDAs. He had asked them about taking on the PowerBook 1400 as well, but they were building laptops for Compaq at the time and were concerned about potentially also making a competitor's product. Quanta was a fairly small company back then, but has grown considerably since. They've made products for a variety of well-known brands and still work with Apple regularly, making devices like the Apple Watch and MacBook Pro. While the 1400 was a solid and popular option for consumers, professionals wanted more. And they got it just a few months later when the PowerBook 3400 debuted in February of 1997. Rumors of the machine, codenamed Hooper, had been circulating since the previous year, and magazines like Macworld reported that it would likely feature a 133 MHz processor, with a higher-end 150 MHz version arriving later. They were wrong, in the best possible way. The base model 3400 shipped with a 180 MHz PowerPC 603E, with a mid-range option running at 200 MHz. That was fast for laptops in general, not just Macs, and the high-end 240 MHz version got the attention of even die-hard PC users. Up to that point, the fastest Windows laptops were only pushing 166 MHz, and this was of course during a time when very few Windows users took Apple products seriously. So for the company to drop a Mac laptop that smoked the best portable PCs, well, it was a big deal. And the 3400 didn't just offer faster speed, it was an all-around good machine. Its motherboard was based on the newer PCI architecture, its maximum RAM was more than double that of the 1400s at 144 megabytes, and it offered lots of smaller features that were well appreciated, like a standard VGA video output and this novel combo network modem card. It supported both 10BASE-T Ethernet as well as 33.6 dial-up, all out of one jack, and an included adapter allowed you to use both at the same time. Now, if the 3400 looks familiar, it's for good reason. When Utagawa designed the 5300, he intentionally left the option to produce a deeper version of the chassis in case management changed its mind about not including an optical drive. In fact, while the 3400 was from 1997, its design dates back to the middle of 1995, right after the 5300 was finalized. There were some additional tweaks made to it as well. It brought back stereo speakers, putting them in the corners above the keyboard, and went even further by adding a gentle bulge to the back of the display to fit an extra pair of woofers to help with the bass response. Compared to what modern laptops can do, it sounds horrible, but at the time, it was kinda impressive. Of course, the machine shipped with a CD-ROM drive module, which was hot swappable for other devices in the expansion bay. All of the same modules from the 5300 worked in it, and when one of those was used, this clever little spring-loaded flap covered the gap. Apple and Sony even managed to sort out the battery situation, so the 3400 shipped with a lithium-ion pack that thankfully was drama-free. The machine was a hit with professionals and power users, and it proved to be a solid, reliable laptop. Reviews were overall very good, with the few complaints being the ones you'd probably expect. The machine was big, heavy, and expensive. And it certainly was in all three regards, but not overly so. In fact, it was almost exactly the same size and weight as the PowerBook 500 series. But compared to where the rest of the industry was going, it was definitely on the heftier side at a bit over 7 pounds. At least its bigger size was put to good use, housing a 12-inch active matrix LCD, the largest of any Mac laptop up to that point. It certainly was an expensive machine. It seems like the most popular model was the 200 MHz version, which came with 16 megabytes of RAM and a 2 GB hard drive, and sold for $5,500 US. The Speed Demon 240 MHz model was $1,000 more, and it only stepped up to a 3 GB drive. There was a base model 180 MHz version that cut costs by switching to a 1.3 GB drive, stepping down from a 12 times to a 6 times CD-ROM, and omitting that cool combo network modem card. And that one still went for a bit under $5,000. But the craziest thing? The machine was actually not a bad deal at that price. At the time, 166 MHz Pentium-based PC laptops were selling for around that same amount, with otherwise similar specifications. And with as fast as the computer industry was moving at the time, the 3400 held onto its claim as the world's fastest laptop for quite a while, through most of 1997, and only finally gave it up when Intel released its so-called Tillamook series of mobile Pentium CPUs towards the end of the year. Apple was just messed up during the early to mid-90s. There was lots of internal fighting between groups, projects getting off track, and its operating system situation was a running joke. It was also hurting financially, partially because its push to license the macOS to other manufacturers completely backfired. I mean, you know it's serious when Mac-centric magazines have to run cover stories describing the launch of the 3400 as Apple fighting back. Yet, with all its troubles, the company managed to produce a solid laptop lineup. The 1400 was the affordable consumer option, the 2400 was the quick yet compact sub-notebook for road warriors, and the 3400 was the powerful desktop replacement for professionals. Of course, not many 3400s were sold. I don't ever remember seeing another one in person other than my own, not really even in computer stores. But strangely enough, these days they regularly show up on eBay, and decent ones sell for a couple of $100. And if you're interested in exploring the classic macOS on period hardware, but don't want to commit to the space a desktop would take up, a 3400 could be a great option. Masamichi Utagawa ended up leaving Apple in 1995, basically right after the design for the 3400 was finished, and went on to found his own company called Antenna Design. He's still there and works on a variety of projects like furniture, voice-over IP office phones, and interestingly enough, New York City subway cars. And for as maligned as the PowerBook 5300 was, I think he ended up redeeming himself. There's a subtle, irony, maybe, to the fact that such a letdown of a product would go on, in one way or another, to become part of Apple's brightest spots during a very dark time. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp, and as always, thanks for watching. And if you're wondering how a 15-year-old ended up with a brand new PowerBook 3400, I won it in a sweepstakes Apple ran on its website at the time.